Sheriff Clarke, coming in to us from Milwaukee. Sheriff, what do you think about these protests last night?
Stuart, first of all, it is a great day in America. There's no sweeter sound to my ears than the phrase President-elect Donald Trump. Look, these are anarchists. These are the ones that we've been putting up with, the cop haters, for a long time. They are in shock. They're in shock because the liberal mainstream media made everybody believe that Mrs. Bill Clinton would be the next president of the United States. They never saw this coming, so they're going through stages of grief. One of the first stages is outrage and anger over what has just happened. But we have a time-honored tradition in this country, okay, and it's gone back all the way to the beginning of the Constitution. It is called the peaceful transfer of power. Mrs. Bill Clinton called for it yesterday. Barack Obama called for it yesterday. I expect these anarchists to follow what their leaders are saying. Look, I'll be patient with them for a little bit. I know what they're going through, but think about this, Stuart. In 2008, when Barack Obama was elected, and in 2012, I didn't see anybody on the right taking to the streets. We honored the results. Maybe we didn't like it. Maybe we're disappointed. But that is a time-honored tradition in this country that has to be upheld. So I'll give them a little time to get over their grief, and then it's time to quell this stuff.
Yeah,
Well, you know, Barack Obama for 7+ years has played the race card that every time somebody criticized him, it was because he was black, and it scared off a lot of Republicans. So now they're going to switch and try to play the gender card. The problem is the American public is tired of this class warfare. The reason why they don't like Mrs. Bill Clinton is not because she's a woman. It's because she's dishonest and because she is hiding something. She's hiding the truth. She tries to play herself off as a victim, like she's Little Red Riding Hood, but she's more like the big bad wolf. As soon as you turn your back on you, she'll bite you. Now, look, this is politics. It's a contact sport. It's not for the faint of heart. My response to what President Obama said is if she can't stand the heat, she should get out of the kitchen.
Julie? Well, first and foremost, I think you just proved my point, Sheriff. And, you know, you and I were outnumbered last week, and I love you, but she's not Mrs. Bill Clinton. She happens to be Hillary Rodham Clinton, who's her own person and is running as her own individual. She's a former senator. She's a Secretary of State. She's not Mrs. Bill Clinton, and I think you just encapsulated exactly why a lot of women think that she's not getting a fair...
It's not my job to give you her bio.
It's not her bio, but it's also not your job to assume that she's just the little woman who's married to
She has run with that name for a long time.
Well, she's run for that name because she happens to be married to the former president, but she's certainly not Mrs. Bill Clinton.
She should embrace it.
Well, no, she actually shouldn't embrace it. She should embrace the fact that she's a very accomplished lawyer in her own right, a very accomplished woman in her own right.
Let me ask you this, Julie, let me ask you this. Do you think there's something to the notion that many Americans find the idea of a female president somehow threatening? Do you think there's anything to that?
You know, unfortunately I do, and it's a shame because I think, but you have polling showing, poll after poll showing, you have Anna Greenberg, who is a very prominent pollster, saying that her numbers went up when she focused specifically on women's issues, whether it's standing by her man when she was First Lady after the Monica Lewinsky scandal, or working on traditional women's issues, or even working as Secretary of State for Barack Obama, who's a man, but her numbers are not so great when she's running for something, when she's working in healthcare reform, when she's become a principal and taken on roles that are traditionally men's roles. And I think, unfortunately, I hate to say this because as a woman who is living in the 21st century, I would hope this is not the case, but empirical data shows, unfortunately, that it is the case.
Mm-hmm. You know, Sheriff, I remember 8 years ago, when Sarah Palin was on the Republican ticket, they were doing full articles about how she was going to balance her situation of having, I think, 5 kids and being vice president. It was just like, basically, for lack of a better term, screw you for writing that, right? Because nobody was wondering how Barack Obama was going to balance having 2 kids.
Yep.
So it's, I mean,
Megan,
it's still there to some extent.
you took the words out of my mouth.
Go ahead.
When you mentioned Sarah Palin, because the way the Democrats treated Sarah Palin was nothing short of shameful. Also, the way they treated Condoleezza Rice when she was the Secretary of State, they did the same thing. So all of a sudden, when it's one of those women who gets close to the White House, then it's okay to trash them. But when it's one of their women, then they try to play the victim card. America's tired of that stuff right now. She should stand on her own 2 feet. Take the heat. Look, this is for the presidency of the United States. Nobody's going to feel sorry for her.
Right.
Nobody's going to back down. I'm glad Donald Trump's not handling her with kid gloves.
Milwaukee County Sheriff David Clarke, thanks for coming on. Sheriff Clarke, this is horrific, what happened, obviously. But do you think it is fair to link this murder to the Black Lives Matter movement when we still don't know the suspect's motive?
I think it's very fair. in light of the anti-cop rhetoric that is sweeping the United States of America, fueled by this group, some of the vulgar, vile, vicious rhetoric that's coming out, talking about killing cops, and that's just some of the nice stuff, some of the stuff I can't even say here on TV. But there is no doubt in my mind that the two New York officers, Ramos and Lou, who were gunned down by an individual who made Facebook postings about wanting to kill pigs, and he was going to go out and hunt officers down. There have been officers across the United States who've had their cruisers shot at and struck while they patrolled. St. Louis, the same thing. Yes, this is part of a pattern now, and you'd have to stick your head in the sand to think that this thing here wasn't fueled by this vile, vulgar, slimy movement.
Mark?
I disagree with your characterization of BLM, but I'd be curious to ask you, do you think that every cop who's been killed this year is connected somehow, the death is connected to BLM?
No, but there's an increase in assaults on police officers, the killings of police officers that may not be directly related to this movement, but you know what, there's no fear anymore about assaulting or attacking, fighting, disarming, or generally, like I said, assaulting law enforcement officers. And you know what? If the shoe fits, wear it. Just like the Dylan Roof, right, who went into a church and slaughtered 9 churchgoers and every white person in America by this Black Lies movement, L-I-E-S, was indicted because of that. And other people came out and talked about slavery, discrimination, alive and well in the United States. Well, that's why I said if the shoe fits here, wear it.
Right. I'm glad that you're saying if the shoe fits, because as a police officer, I would hope you would want to emphasize things like probable cause, due suspicion, investigation. The police officials...
Darren Wilson didn't get that, Mark.
Let me finish.
You know that. The officers in the Freddie Gray case did not get that assumption of innocence. So for you to stand up and throw that out now,
Sheriff, I haven't said... All right, I'll let you finish.
It's hypocritical.
All right.
It's hypocritical. The police officers in the Freddie Gray case didn't get that presumption of innocence.
All right, I've let you speak the entire
Darren
segment.
Wilson didn't get that presumption of innocence.
Please let me respond. By law, we're entitled to a presumption of innocence. Even if you think that those people didn't get what they deserved, as a police officer, I hope you wouldn't say, well, 2 wrongs make a right. If anything, we should be emphasizing due process and investigation here. And in this case, the people handling the case in Texas themselves have said very clearly, we don't know the motive. So you're essentially saying that your colleagues in law enforcement who say we don't know the motive are wrong and that you do know the motive. The second piece I want to say is that your characterization of Black Lives Matter is absolutely incorrect. The argument of Black Lives Matter is not to say that police officers should be killed, that police officers should be demonized, that police officers should be marginalized. The argument of Black Lives Matter is that police officers should be held to standards of accountability just like everybody else, and the increased number of black bodies, or the sustained number of black bodies which die at the hands of state violence, needs to end. It means that while we regard all lives, we cannot exclude black lives.
What about the black victims that die at the hands of other black people? That doesn't seem to matter. And they're dying by the thousands, not by the few rare instances of the police use of force.
But let me ask you this, Sheriff Clarke. I mean, just looking at the numbers here, if we're going to bring that up, there were 24 unarmed African Americans killed by police this year. That's according to the Washington Post. So when you take that into account, Sheriff Clarke, do you think that African Americans, people part of this protest, have a right to have their voices heard and to protest?
It's not a matter of whether they have a right. It's a matter of whether it's legitimate. There are 104 homicides in the city of Milwaukee right now. I think there were 79 last year. Baltimore, 214. They've already matched all of 2014. So when you want to take that 24, I'm not saying that that none of that is legitimate in terms of taking a look at them, but how many of them were ruled justifiable? How many of the uses of force were determined to be reasonable and justifiable? And then let's compare that 24 to the number of stops made by police officers during that time period, and you'll find that that is a very, very fractional percentage of deaths that occur at the hands of police officers. That's what the data shows anyway.
I've been pretty active, both following, covering, and as a protester being engaged in these struggles, and I've never seen anyone in the Black Lives Matter movement or any other principled movement against police violence say that most police stops result in unlawful executions or unlawful shootings or even unlawful violence. The argument is that it happens too often, and when it does, we don't have sufficient mechanisms of accountability. Let me finish.
What's too often?
Let me finish. Well, anytime someone gets killed unlawfully or a police officer acts as judge, jury, and executioner, it's too many. I would hope you would agree that even one would be too many. But we've seen dozens of them.
Well, that's a mischaracterization right there, that every time a law enforcement officer has to use force, they're acting as judge, jury, and executioner.
I didn't say that. Hold on. I did not say that.
Let's apply the facts of the case
to the
rule of law. And if the rule of law
but Sheriff, I didn't say that.
Gives the benefit of the doubt to the officer.
You're just making arguments here, and I didn't say that. What I said is, under the circumstances when that is the case, one is too many. I didn't say that every time it happens, that's the case. I'm saying under the circumstances.
Emotion and anecdote are not facts, Mark.
They're not anecdotes. They're strong evidence here. The problem is police officers are the overseers, and so you all decide what cases are legitimate and which ones aren't. That in and of itself is a problem, and that's what we're trying to deal with.
And by the way, though, just to give you the other side of the stats, Sheriff Goforth is the 25th officer, person in uniform killed just this year. 24 unarmed black men. He is the 25th officer to be killed. Way too many on both sides.
No,
I think
it's not the same thing,
we can all agree.
If being black and outside presents the same danger as being a police officer who signs up for a dangerous job, that's pretty scary. Can you imagine if just being black entitles you to the same
like
nobody should die.
Nobody,
defenseless.
I think we can all agree nobody should die.
Nobody should die. You're just playing to the cheap seats. Nobody should die.
I didn't sign up for that, and I don't send men and women out every day to serve their communities to end up with that as a result.
I hope not.
Sheriff Clarke, you also mentioned that, the use of force should be examined in terms of factual data and not an emotional foundation of false narratives. Is that correct? Did I get your testimony correct in that regard?
Mr. Chair and Congressman, yes.
Okay. Now, what was the reaction to the Eric Garner case, who was choked to death using a procedure that had been banned by the NYPD for more than 20 years, wasn't resisting arrest, said, "I can't breathe" 11 times on 11 different occasions. There was no response by all of the police officers who were there. Was that a false narrative that people in the city of New York and the country are reacting to, sir?
Mr. Chair, Congressman, first of all, he wasn't choked to death, not from the report that I had seen out of the grand jury testimony, and even from the medical examiner's report. He wasn't choked to death.
The medical examiner ruled the death a homicide by asphyxiation. In the ghetto, that's called being choked to death, sir.
Well, we could have this discussion later on then about the facts, because we could be here for a while. My understanding is he died of a heart attack, okay? So, but anyway, you said that he wasn't resisting arrest. He was resisting arrest. He was told that he was under arrest and put his hands behind his back, and he wouldn't do so. And that's why I put in my remarks here the reference from Thomas Sowell about when law enforcement officers tell someone they're under arrest and they can't use force to execute that arrest. We don't have the rule of law when it's merely a suggestion for them that they're going to jail or to put their hands behind their back. Those are behaviors, like in the instance of Mike Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, where some different choices by the individual could have helped the situation.
Like many of you, I'm concerned about the impact of the recent executive orders signed by President Trump. We need to keep this country safe, but we should do that by focusing on people who actually pose a threat. We should also keep our doors open to refugees and those who need help. That's who we are. And of course, we just learned that Mark Zuckerberg was also
building his own wall.
Building his own wall around his Hawaiian
personal
home.
Property.
What do you make of that?
Yeah, a little hypocritical.
First of all, I'm tired of one percenters like Mark Zuckerberg and others lecturing us about who we are. I know who I am, and most Americans know who we are. We are a sovereign nation. If you're going to have a sovereign, if you're going to be a sovereign nation, you have to have borders, and you have to protect those borders. Mark Zuckerberg has no idea who's coming into this country and what it takes to vet those individuals. I, as a law enforcement officer, I'm in my 39th year. We do a lot of vetting of people. I know how it's done, but you have to have databases with which to compare. So you take a name, someone coming in as a refugee. We're not talking about the kids. I'm tired of all this, you know, throwing the crocodile tears about the kids, the poor kids coming. We're not talking about that. We're talking about able-bodied grown men fighting age that should be back in Syria and back in the Middle East fighting for their country, coming over to the United States to spread jihad. So that's who we're talking about. But if you don't have a database, someone gives you a name, and you don't have a database in Syria because they don't have the record systems and the databases like we have with people, you have nothing to compare it to. So they give you a name and you look and there's nothing there. That doesn't mean that they're safe to come in. So Donald Trump is right on this, and I hope that the rest of the people in Washington, D.C. realize that this thing is a mess, and we have to get our arms around it, and at least President Donald Trump recognizes that.
Sheriff, thank you very much for that horrific day. I spoke to the heads of the Sheriff Department, the Police Department, and the state police down there, and they told us how their hearts were reeling. Their message is peace and coming together in the country. What's your message?
You don't believe that for 1 minute, do you?
That their message is?
Yeah.
That's what they said to me.
Okay.
Yeah, I believe them. Of course
Any
I believe them
protests
when they say
over the deaths of these cops today in Baton Rouge?
I don't know that. I don't know that.
Any riots or protests over the police officers in Dallas, Texas?
What are you asking?
It's a pretty simple question.
I asked you if what's your message to the people. Their message is one of peace. What is your message?
My message has been clear from day one 2 years ago. This anti-cop sentiment from this hateful ideology called Black Lives Matter has fueled this rage against the American police officer. I predicted this 2 years ago. So what I want to know,
okay, Sheriff.
do I want to know?
With all due respect, do you know that this was because of that? Do we
Yes,
know
I
that
do.
As a law enforcement officer?
I've been watching this for 2 years. I predicted this. This anti-police rhetoric sweeping the country has turned out some hateful things inside of people that are now playing themselves out on the American police officer. I want to know, with all of the black-on-black violence in the United States of America, by the way, when the tragedies happened in Louisiana and Minnesota, you know that 21 black people were murdered across the United States? Was there any reporting on that?
There was a black officer who was killed today. But
was there any reporting on that?
Sheriff, please, let's just keep the volume down here. So I understand, and listen, I don't.
I'm looking at
disagree.
3 dead cops this week,
Sheriff,
and I'm looking at 5 last year. You trying to tell me to keep it down?
Just please, if you'll just please, we can keep it civil. So, because the message to people at home, I'm sure you want, is one of civility.
I wish, Don, I wish you had that message of civility
to have a conversation
toward this
with you.
hateful ideology, these purveyors of hate.
You don't know what my message is.
That's
what I
what
want
they
to say
do.
to you is,
these people preach
are you going to let me get a word
and
in?
virtue
We'll be right
in the
back.
name
We're
of
going to go to break,
hate.
and we'll be right back. All I want to do is have a conversation. I can't have a conversation with you if we're both talking at the same time. What it sounds like to me is that you're accusing me of violence and supporting something, a narrative that I'm not necessarily in support of. And if that's what you're accusing me of violence, then you can leave. That's not true. I don't support violence of any type against police officers, against anyone. So if you're accusing me of that, then you're welcome to leave. But if you want to have a conversation, I am more than willing to welcome a conversation with you. I don't disagree with you about there's a narrative across the country that could be harming police officers. But we don't know right now, as someone who's in law enforcement, if that was the actual cause of it. Go ahead.
Let me ask you this. Do we know that generally the American law enforcement officers are racist? Do we know this?
Go on.
I ask a question.
Do I know American general law enforcement are racist? I don't think anyone is accusing. If you're insinuating that people are accusing or saying that law enforcement across this country as a whole are racist, then your assumption is wrong.
First of all, this whole anti-police rhetoric is based on a lie. There is no data, and you know this. There is no data, there is no research that proves any of that nonsense. None.
You'd have to be more specific about what data and what nonsense you're talking about.
That law enforcement officers treat black males different than white males in policing in these urban centers.
There is data that supports
There is not data.
No, The president spoke about it. Cedric Alexander, who is a law
president has
enforcement
been
officer,
lying about it. He said it again the other day when he said black males are 2 times more likely to be shot by a law enforcement officer than white males. Don, that is a lie.
That is not a lie.
It is a lie.
Yes,
Show me.
Research.
Show me.
The research
Show it to me
that we have from the Washington Post. That
the Washington
facilitated
Post
study.
debunked that
There's
nonsense.
also research.
He also said
Sheriff,
this time.
There's also research.
He
from
continues.
A Harvard professor that also showed that black people are treated more aggressively by police officers.
No, you are wrong
people.
in your interpretation of that Harvard study, because I read the study. That's not what he said. He said he was surprised to find
that in shootings of the most severe in shootings that he found no evidence that there was a difference. Also, it should be noted that that study was a very small sampling of police departments across the country. Many people did not find it credible, but it is also interesting that in that research he found that blacks were treated differently when it came to aggressive policing, but for the most egregious shootings he found no difference. That's what that study showed.
Well, based on what? Just generally? Are we talking about high crime areas? Are we talking about police officers being under attack? Because let's go back to where this whole thing started in Ferguson, Missouri. The lie was hands up, don't shoot.
You're lumping a whole bunch of things into one. If we can do one specific
That's
thing
where this whole phony movement started. It started out as hands up, don't shoot.
You're talking about Black Lives Matter.
Right.
Okay. So if you want to, you would need to speak to someone who is a member of Black Lives Matter about whether they have perpetrated a fraud on the American people. That's up to Black Lives Matter. That's not me. I'm neither a member of Black Lives Matter, I'm neither a supporter or someone who doesn't support them. I simply report on Black Lives Matter.
Do you condemn the anti-police rhetoric coming from this hateful ideology?
As a journalist sitting here on television, I don't have to condemn anyone, anything. That is something that you should ask. Other people around the country,
I condemn
their jobs to condemn
just
that.
like I condemn the hateful ideology out of groups like the KKK. All right? I condemn it. There is no place in American discourse for that sort of vile, vitriolic hate coming out of this ideology. This has fueled and fanned the flames of this anger toward the American police officer. There's only one group in America, one time, that truly cares about the lives of black people in these urban ghettos. And it's the American police officer who goes down there on a daily basis, puts their life on the line to protect who? Black people. So when you say we just want to have a conversation, let's have a conversation about the black-on-black crime, which kills more black males, which is more of a threat to any black male in the United States than a law enforcement officer.
Sheriff, yes, that's a different conversation. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. There's an issue when it comes to violence. Black-on-black crime, or it's crime. White people kill white people, tend to kill white people. Black people tend to kill black people.
Not in the numbers.
That's fine, but that's a different conversation.
I don't care who white people are killing.
That is a different conversation than police brutality, and we're not having that conversation right now. And again, I want to be very clear with you. I condemn all violence of any type, just for the record.
Was the situation between Mike Brown and Darren Wilson, was that police brutality?
But we're not talking about Mike Brown and Darren Wilson.
I am.
No, if you're asking me what the Justice Department showed, the Justice Department showed that it exonerated Officer Darren Wilson, and that the hands up, don't shoot narrative was a false narrative. That has been reported by CNN and by others.
That was another phony report.
What does that have to do with Baton Rouge, Louisiana?
All right, because when you take in
what does that have to do with Baton Rouge, Louisiana?
Rates of involvement in violent crime, and crime in general, but violent crime, you're going to see that black males are overrepresented. Overrepresented in terms of being involved in violent crime. That's going to mean more arrests. That's going to mean more people going to prison. This stuff has already been debunked.
Sheriff, that's a different conversation.
Every time you don't have a response to something I say, you say it's a different conversation.
I don't have a response to you. Is that we're having two different conversations. I'm talking about I'm asking the questions here. You're answering the questions by asking questions about some other subject that we're not discussing.
We're talking about
not a
this hateful ideology called Black Lives Matter. You said you're not a member. You can't be a member. It's not an organization.
That's
no structure.
That's what you're talking about.
Listen, I understand, and it is a hateful ideology.
I understand it's a very stressful time for you.
These individuals.
And Sheriff, we appreciate you coming on.
They preach vile and vitriol in the name